When I first met Daniel, he wasn't the man I married. He was gentler then, quieter, with that shy smile that never quite reached his eyes. He worked at the same little bookstore where I spent most of my evenings after work, hiding between shelves and pretending to read while stealing glances at him. I didn't know it then, but I was already building a life in my head, one that revolved around him. I was 23, fresh out of college, still figuring out who I was supposed to be. He was older by 4 years, already steady, already someone who looked like he had the world figured out. I fell for that steadiness. It felt safe. It felt like home. Looking back now, maybe that's what I really wanted. Not a man, but a feeling of safety. Someone to anchor me when the world felt too big. We got married 2 years later in a small ceremony behind his parents' house. It wasn't fancy, just close friends, a few candles, and my mother crying happy tears that I'd found someone who seemed like a good man. And he was. In those early years, he really was. He'd wake up early to make coffee for both of us, leave little notes by the sink, and kiss me on the forehead before heading to work. I'd spend my mornings cooking, cleaning, and planning our life, where we'd move, what kind of house we'd buy, the trips we'd take once we settled down. But settling down came quicker than I thought. Too quick, maybe. Within 3 years, we had our first child, a little boy named Michael. I left my job to stay home with him. It was supposed to be temporary, just until he was old enough for school. But as the months turned into years, that temporary became permanent. And slowly, I began to fade into the background of my own life. Daniel worked long hours. At first, I admired him for it. He wanted to give us a good life, and I believed that was love, providing, working hard, building something for us. But I didn't realize how much of me I was giving away in the process. I stopped dressing up. I stopped reading. I stopped meeting friends. Everything I did revolved around our home, our child, our life together. He'd come home tired, and I'd try to make everything perfect, dinner on the table, house spotless, Michael bathed and asleep. I'd tell him about our day, but his eyes would glaze over halfway through, already fixed on the television. Sometimes I'd laugh and say, "You don't hear a word I'm saying, do you?" He'd smile and reply, "Of course I do." But I knew he didn't. Still, I told myself this was just a phase. That's what marriage is, right? You go through quiet seasons and then you find your way back. But the quiet kept growing. By the time our daughter Lily was born, we hardly talked about anything beyond bills, groceries, and schedules. The laughter we used to share, the kind that came so easily in the beginning, became rare. And yet, I kept going. I told myself that my worth was in what I gave, that if I kept the house warm, if I raised kind children, if I stood by him no matter what, it would all be seen, it would all be remembered. But love doesn't always work like that. There were nights when I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to his steady breathing beside me, wondering if he ever thought about the woman I used to be, the one he fell in love with, the one who laughed too loud, dreamed too big, and believed she could change the world with her kindness. She felt like a ghost sometimes, a soft echo I could barely recognize. When Daniel got promoted, we moved into a bigger house. Everyone said we were doing so well, but I didn't feel well. I felt small. The bigger the house got, the smaller I seemed to become inside it. Every room was filled with reminders of the life I'd built, the meals cooked, the clothes folded, the children's laughter, but no trace of me. And I think that's when it began, the slow unraveling. The distance didn't happen all at once. It was in the little things. The way he stopped asking how my day was, the way he forgot my birthday one year and just shrugged it off with a quick, "Sorry, work's been crazy." The way he'd talk to his friends about how hard he worked, how he was the one carrying the family. I wanted to scream, "What about me?" But I didn't, Because good wives don't scream, good wives smile and understand. So I smiled. I understood. And every day, I lost a little more of myself. By the time the kids were in high school, I was tired. Not just physically, but tired in my soul. I'd look at Daniel across the dinner table, his face buried in his phone or a newspaper, and think, when did we stop seeing each other? He still provided, he still came home, he never yelled, never raised a hand, and yet, somehow, the silence between us was louder than any fight could ever be. I remember one evening standing at the sink, washing dishes while the sunset painted the kitchen gold. He walked in, dropped his briefcase, and sighed heavily. Without looking up, I asked, "Rough day?" He said, "You wouldn't understand." Just that. And something inside me cracked, quietly, like a glass breaking in another room. Because maybe he was right. Maybe I didn't understand his world anymore. But I also knew he didn't understand mine either, the one filled with endless lists, quiet sacrifices, and the kind of loneliness that sits beside you even when you're not alone. Still, I kept hoping. I thought one day he'd see it. All the meals cooked, the tears hidden, the love poured out in every small thing. I thought maybe, just maybe, he'd look at me and remember that I was more than just the woman who kept things running. But love, when unspoken for too long, begins to fade into duty. And duty doesn't make your heart feel alive. It just keeps it beating. The silence between us became a habit. It wasn't angry or heavy anymore. It was just there, like background noise I had learned to live with. We didn't argue. We didn't fight. We just stopped talking. I remember one night, after dinner, I sat on the couch and tried to show Daniel some old pictures I'd found while cleaning the attic. There we were, both of us younger, smiling, arms wrapped around each other like the world couldn't touch us. I said softly, "Look at us back then. We look so happy." He barely glanced up from his phone and muttered, "Yeah, those were simpler times." Simpler times. He said it like it was something far behind us, something that couldn't be reached anymore. I smiled, but I felt the sting in my chest. I wanted to ask, when did we stop being simple? When did love become so complicated? But the words stayed locked in my throat. So I just kept smiling. That's what I learned to do best. I filled my days with things that didn't need him: gardening, volunteering at the local shelter, helping the kids with school projects. I told myself it was fine, that marriage changes, that people grow apart but still stay loyal. But late at night, when I lay beside him and felt the emptiness between us stretch like miles, I wondered if loyalty was enough to keep love alive. When Michael left for college, I cried for days. Not just because my son was leaving, but because his leaving made the house feel even quieter. Lily was still in high school then, busy with friends and her own life. And Daniel, he seemed relieved. He said things like, "Now we can finally have time for ourselves." I thought maybe he meant us together. But he didn't. He started going out more, business dinners, work trips, late meetings. He said it was all for the company, all for our future. I believed him, or maybe I just wanted to. But deep down, I could feel something shifting. Not just in him, but in me too. I started feeling invisible. He'd walk past me in the mornings like I was a piece of furniture, something familiar, always there, never noticed. Sometimes I'd sit at the kitchen table with my coffee, watching him scroll through his emails
and wonder if he even saw me anymore. One morning, I tried to start a conversation. "I've been thinking of going back to work," I said, trying to sound casual, now that the kids are older. He looked up, surprised. "Why would you do that? You don't need to work. Everything's taken care of." I smiled faintly. "I know. I miss feeling useful." He frowned. "You are useful. You keep things running here." And then he went back to his phone. Useful. The word lingered like smoke in the air. Not loved, not valued, just useful. That night I sat in the bathtub for almost an hour, staring at the tiled wall, letting the water grow cold. I thought about the years that had passed, all the dinners cooked, all the birthdays planned, all the moments I'd held him when he was tired or lost. And yet somehow, I had become nothing more than the woman who kept things running. The next few months passed like that. Quiet days, quiet nights. Lily graduated and we celebrated. Daniel smiled proudly, hugged her, and told everyone how hard he had worked to provide for her education. I stood beside him, smiling too, clapping for our daughter, pretending not to notice how my own contributions, the homework help, the packed lunches, the late nights comforting her through tears, went unmentioned. After everyone left, I stood alone in the kitchen, washing dishes. Daniel walked in, loosened his tie, and said, "It was a great day." I said softly, "It was. I'm proud of her." He nodded. "Yeah, she's a reflection of me, you know? My hard work finally showing." I froze for a second, my hands still under the warm water. And then I looked at him and smiled, because that's what I had been trained to do. But inside, something shifted. A quiet voice whispered, "No, she's a reflection of both of us. Maybe even more of me." That night when he fell asleep, I sat at the edge of the bed, watching him. He looked peaceful, content. And I wondered if he ever thought about me, not as his wife, not as the mother of his children, but as a person. Did he remember the girl who laughed in that bookstore, the one who used to dream? Or had she been buried under the years of cooking, cleaning, understanding, forgiving? Sometimes I catch myself looking at old pictures, trying to find traces of that woman I used to be. She had bright eyes and hope in her smile. Now my reflection in the mirror looked tired. Not just from age, but from being unseen for too long. Then came the day that changed everything. It was ordinary, like most days are before something breaks. He came home late, again. I'd kept dinner warm, again. When he finally walked through the door, I smiled and said, "You're home. I'll reheat your food." He waved his hand dismissively. "Don't bother. I already ate." I froze for a second, the plate still in my hand. "Oh, okay." He sat down, loosened his tie, and started talking about work, how exhausted he was, how much pressure he was under. I listened quietly, nodding, waiting for my turn to speak. When he finally paused, I said gently, "I know you've been working hard. I just wish you'd let me take care of you." He looked at me, tired and annoyed, and then he said it. Those words I'll never forget. He said, "You take care of me? You never did anything for me, Linda." The room went still. The clock ticked. Somewhere in the distance, a car drove by, but inside me, everything went silent. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. I blinked, trying to understand. What did you just say? He sighed impatiently. You know what I mean. I work. I provide. Everything we have is because of me. You've had it easy all these years. Easy. The word hit me like a slap. I stood there, my hands trembling, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to scream, to list every sacrifice I had ever made, every time I'd gone without, every time I'd put him first. But no words came out. I just stood there, looking at the man I had built my whole life around, the man I had loved more than myself, and realized he didn't see me at all. Not the sleepless nights, not the years I gave up my dreams, not the times I stood by him when he was broken. To him, I was invisible. That night after he went to bed, I sat alone in the dark living room. The clock on the wall ticked softly, each second echoing in the quiet. And I thought, maybe this is what breaking feels like. Not loud, not sudden, just a quiet collapse inside your own chest. I didn't cry right away. The tears came hours later, quietly, when the world was asleep. I cried for the girl I used to be, for the woman I became, and for the love that had forgotten me.
I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch until dawn, watching the soft gray light crawl across the living room floor. The house was silent, except for the sound of the refrigerator humming and the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. I kept hearing his words over and over. You never did anything for me. They echoed in my head, each repetition duller but heavier. It's strange how a few words can undo years of love, years of shared memories. When I finally went to the bedroom, he was still asleep, his face calm and peaceful, as if nothing had happened. I looked at him for a long time, searching for the man I once knew, the one who used to hold me when I cried, the one who promised I'd never feel alone. But that man was gone, or maybe he'd never really been who I thought he was. I went into the bathroom, turned on the tap, and splashed cold water on my face. I looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes were swollen, my hair messy, and there was this unfamiliar sadness on my face, the kind that doesn't come from one night of crying, but from years of being unseen. I whispered to my reflection, maybe he's right. Maybe I really did nothing. And then I stopped, because even saying it felt wrong. Deep down, I knew I'd done everything. I had held that home together when we couldn't afford help. I had made birthdays special when money was tight. I had stayed up through sickness, through his bad moods, through loneliness. And somehow, in his eyes, all of that had turned invisible. That morning, I made breakfast like I always did. He came downstairs, glanced at the table, and said, "You didn't have to cook. I told you I grabbed something last night." I just nodded. I know, but I wanted to. He didn't notice my voice tremble. He didn't notice anything. I watched him leave for work, his car pulling out of the driveway like every other morning. But this time, something inside me stayed behind. The part of me that used to wait for him, used to look forward to him coming home. It was gone. After he left, I sat at the table with my cup of coffee and just stared at the steam rising. For the first time in years, I didn't rush to clean the dishes or start laundry. I just sat there, breathing, listening to the quiet. And in that quiet, I started remembering. I remembered how in the early days, I used to sing while cooking, how he used to peek into the kitchen and say, "You make even Mondays feel special." I remembered how he once said he couldn't imagine his life without me. And now he acted like I'd never been part of it at all.
The more I thought about it, the more I realized how much I'd built my entire world around him and how easily he'd taken it for granted. By the afternoon, I decided to go for a walk. The air was crisp, the sky pale blue, the kind of day that should have felt peaceful. I passed by neighbors, some of whom waved politely. I smiled back, pretending I was fine. But inside, I was having conversations I couldn't have out loud. I kept hearing my own voice saying, "You gave everything. You were enough. You mattered." And then I'd hear his voice, cold, dismissive. "You never did anything for me." Somewhere between those two voices, I realized I had a choice to make. I could keep living as the woman who needed him to see her worth, or I could start remembering it for myself. That evening, I did something small, but it felt big. I didn't wait for him to come home. I didn't reheat dinner or keep the lights on for him. Instead, I took a long bath, lit a candle, and played the music I used to love, the kind I hadn't listened to in years because he said it was too sentimental. As I lay there, eyes closed, I let myself breathe again. The water was warm, the candle flickered softly, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was with myself, not just existing, but being. When he came home, he called out, "You didn't make dinner?" I said from the bathroom, "There's food in the fridge. I already ate." There was silence for a moment, and then his footsteps retreated to the living room. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't ask why I sounded different. And maybe that silence said everything I needed to know. That night, I slept on my side of the bed, facing the window. I didn't cry. I didn't hope. I just let the stillness settle inside me like a quiet truth. The truth that something between us had ended, even if neither of us had said it out loud. In the days that followed, I started changing in small ways. I began going out more, visiting the bookstore again, walking by the lake, buying myself little things that made me happy. At first it felt strange, almost like I was doing something wrong. But then it started to feel like breathing after being underwater for too long. One afternoon, I ran into an old friend from college, Susan. We hadn't seen each other in years. She looked at me and said, "Linda, I almost didn't recognize you. How are you?" I smiled. "I'm okay." We sat at a cafe and talked for hours about old times, about kids, about everything. At one point, she laughed and said, "You always had this light about you. You were the one who believed love could fix anything." I smiled faintly. "I used to." She looked at me, eyes soft, and said, "You still can, you know. Just maybe start with loving yourself this time." That night, her words stayed with me. Start with loving yourself this time. I realized how foreign that idea felt. Loving myself. For years, I'd poured love into everyone else, left none for me. The next morning, I made a list, not of chores, not of errands, but of me. Things I wanted to do, things that made me feel alive. It was a small list, but it was a start. Daniel noticed the changes, though he never said anything directly. One evening, he came home to find me reading by the window. He said, "You're quiet these days." I smiled slightly. "I guess I just don't have much to say anymore." He frowned but didn't respond. The next few weeks passed quietly. We still shared the same house, the same routine, but something had shifted. He no longer looked at me with expectation. Maybe he sensed that I had stopped needing his approval. And for the first time, I didn't feel guilty about it. There was a strange freedom in that. Not happiness exactly, but peace, the kind that comes when you stop begging someone to see you. One Sunday morning, I woke up early and went to the farmer's market alone. I walked through the stalls, bought fresh flowers, and treated myself to coffee. It was the smallest thing, but as I walked home carrying those flowers, I felt something inside me come alive again, a flicker of warmth I hadn't felt in years. I placed the flowers in a vase on the dining table. Daniel looked at them later and asked, Who are those for?" I smiled and said, "For me." He didn't respond, but the look on his face, that faint confusion, maybe even discomfort, told me he knew something was different. And he was right. Something was different. I had finally stopped waiting for him to see me. I had started to see myself instead.
The weeks that followed were slow, but they were mine. Every morning, I'd wake up before Daniel, sit by the kitchen window with my coffee, and just watch the world come alive outside. The birds, the soft morning light, the quiet streets. For years, I'd rush through these moments without noticing them. Now, I savored them. It was strange at first, to live for myself in a house that had always been built around someone else. There was guilt, of course. Guilt for not waiting up for him, for not asking how his day was, for not being the woman who revolved around his world anymore. But alongside that guilt, there was something else growing. A quiet strength I didn't recognize at first. One afternoon, I took out a box of my old things from the attic. Inside were pieces of the woman I'd been before. Paintbrushes, a few old journals, photos from college, even a half-finished canvas. I sat on the floor, surrounded by them, and felt a lump rise in my throat. It was like meeting a version of myself I had abandoned a long time ago. I took one of the brushes, wiped the dust from it, and said softly, "I'm sorry I left you behind." The next day, I set up a small table near the window and started painting again. Nothing special, just colors and shapes, but it felt like opening a window inside me. When Daniel came home that evening, he glanced at the easel and asked, "What's this?" I smiled, "Just something I used to love." He shrugged. "Well, as long as it keeps you busy." Then he walked away. I waited for those words to sting, but they didn't. Not like before. That night, I looked at the half-finished painting and smiled to myself. For the first time in a long time, I didn't need his approval. That realization was both terrifying and freeing. Lily came home for a weekend visit a few weeks later. She walked in, saw the painting supplies, and said, "Mom, you're painting again. That's amazing." I nodded shyly. "I just thought I'd try." She smiled and hugged me. "I love it. You look happy." Her words made me pause. Happy? When was the last time someone had called me that? After she left that Sunday, I sat for a while thinking about what she said. Maybe I was happy. Not in a big, dramatic way, but in a quiet, peaceful one. The kind of happiness that comes when you stop fighting for someone else's love and start nurturing your own soul instead. Daniel started noticing the changes too, even if he didn't know how to handle them. He'd ask things like, "You've been going out a lot lately," or "You seem distant." At first, I tried to reassure him, "I'm just keeping busy." But after a while, I stopped explaining. I didn't owe him an explanation for finding myself again. One evening, he came home late and found me reading at the table. He said, "You didn't wait for me again?" I looked up and said softly, "I stopped waiting a while ago, Daniel." He didn't know how to respond. He just stared at me, then turned away. And that was when I knew. The balance had shifted. He no longer had the power to define me. I started going to art classes at a local community center. The first time I walked in, I felt nervous, like a child on her first day of school. But the moment I picked up a brush, all that nervousness melted away. The instructor, a kind older woman, said to me one afternoon, "You have such emotion in your colors." I smiled, maybe because they've been trapped for years. Slowly, I built a small circle of people who didn't know me as Daniel's wife or Michael and Lily's mom. They just knew me as Linda, the woman who laughed easily, who painted sunsets, who was learning to breathe again. The house felt different now. Lighter, somehow.
Daniel noticed the difference too. One morning, he sat at the breakfast table and said, "You've changed." I met his eyes and said, "Maybe I finally remembered who I was." He frowned. "You make it sound like I did something wrong." I didn't answer that. Some truths don't need to be spoken. They hang in the air, understood, but unacknowledged. As the months passed, we became more like roommates than husband and wife. Polite, distant, coexisting. And strangely, I didn't mind it. The woman who once begged for his attention was gone. The one who remained was calm, steady, and quietly free. One evening, while I was preparing dinner, he came into the kitchen and said, "I don't understand you anymore." I looked at him, smiled softly, and replied, "You never really tried to." He looked at me for a long moment, then left the room. And that was when I knew. The balance had shifted. He no longer had the power to define me. I looked at the window again, watching the rain fall against the glass. I thought about all the years I had spent waiting for love, for recognition, for something that would make me feel whole. And now I realized I had stopped waiting altogether. The healing didn't come at all at once. It came in quiet, almost invisible ways. In the mornings when I woke up without dread, in the laughter that returned little by little, in the small things, cooking my favorite meal just for me, buying myself flowers, sitting in silence without feeling lonely. One Saturday morning, I decided to drive out to the coast. It was a place Daniel and I used to visit when we were first married. The sea had always calmed me, even back then. When I got there, the sky was overcast, and the waves rolled gently toward the shore. I sat on the sand, feeling the wind in my hair, and closed my eyes. For the first time, I didn't think about him. I thought about me, the girl I was, the woman I became, and the one I was still becoming. And in that moment, I whispered to myself, "You did everything you could. You loved with all your heart. That's enough." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was peace. When I came home later that evening, Daniel was sitting in the living room. He looked at me and said, "Where were you?" I replied simply, "I went to the coast." With who?" "With myself." He looked at me for a long time, as if seeing me for the first time. But it was too late for that now. The next few days, he was quieter than usual. Maybe he sensed the distance between us had grown too wide to cross. One evening he asked, "Do you ever think we could go back to how we were?" I smiled sadly. "Back to when I was invisible? No, Daniel. I can't go back there." He nodded slowly, and for once, he didn't argue. He just sat there, silent, and I realized that maybe he finally understood, not what he'd done, but what he'd lost. That night, I packed a small bag, not to leave forever, but to take space. When he saw me at the door, he said, "Are you leaving?" I said softly, "I'm finding myself. I'll be back when I remember how to breathe fully again." And I meant it. I drove to a small cabin near the lake, a place I'd read about in a magazine years ago, but never thought I'd actually visit. It was simple, quiet, surrounded by trees. In the mornings, I'd drink coffee on the porch, listening to the birds. In the evenings, I'd paint until the light faded. It felt like a kind of rebirth, slow, gentle, necessary. I stayed there for 2 weeks. No phone calls, no emails, just me, the world, and the sound of my own heart slowly coming back to life. When I finally returned home, Daniel was waiting by the door. He looked older somehow, tired, softer. He said, "I didn't realize how much you did until you weren't here." I looked at him, steady and calm, and said, I know, but realizing it now doesn't erase all the times you didn't. He nodded, tears in his eyes, and said, I'm sorry. And I believed he was, but something inside me had already changed too much to go back.
When Daniel said he was sorry, I didn't rush to comfort him like I once would have. I didn't reach out to tell him it was okay, because it wasn't. Not really. And yet, for the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to make him understand or change. Some things are better left where they broke. The house was quiet for days after that. We spoke only when we needed to. Short, polite exchanges about bills, dinner, or appointments. But beneath that silence, something had shifted. He had finally seen me, and I had finally stopped waiting to be seen. I started making small choices that felt like acts of freedom. I painted every morning. I joined a weekend art fair and sold a few small pieces. People smiled, asked about my work, and told me how peaceful my colors felt. I laughed more, not loud or forced, just the kind of laughter that comes from deep contentment. One afternoon, Lily came to visit again. She sat with me in the kitchen and said, Mom, you're different now. You look lighter. I smiled. I guess I stopped carrying what wasn't mine to carry. She nodded and said softly, Dad told me he feels like he lost you. I looked out the window and said, he did, but maybe he was never really looking. That night, I sat alone in the living room, the lamplight soft against the walls. I looked around. The same house, the same furniture, but everything felt new, because I had changed. Daniel came in quietly and sat across from me. He said, Linda, I've been thinking about us, about everything. I waited. He hesitated before continuing, You were always there, and I was too proud, too blind to see it. I don't know if I can make it right, but I want to try. For a long moment, I just looked at him. This was the apology I had once prayed for, the words I had imagined hearing during the long nights when I cried silently into my pillow. But now that they were here, they didn't heal me. They only reminded me of how far I'd already come without them. I said gently, I believe you mean that, Daniel. But what's broken between us isn't something an apology can fix. It needed care when it was still whole. He looked down, his hands clasped. So, what happens now? I took a breath. Now, I keep growing. Whether that's with you or without you, I don't know yet. But I know I can't shrink back to who I was. He nodded slowly, and for the first time, there was no anger in his eyes, just understanding, and maybe a little respect. Over the next few months, we found a quiet rhythm, not the closeness we once had, but a kind of peaceful coexistence. Sometimes he'd ask about my paintings, and sometimes I'd ask about his work. We talked, but without the old weight of resentment or expectation. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And that honesty felt like peace. One spring morning, I was invited to display my paintings at a local gallery. It wasn't a big event, just a small community exhibition, but it meant the world to me. I spent days preparing, framing each piece with care. When I stood there on the opening night, surrounded by my work, I felt something bloom inside me. Pride, quiet and steady. People stopped to admire my paintings, to ask about the stories behind them, and when they did, I spoke not of pain, but of healing. Daniel came too.
He stood in the corner for a while, looking at one painting, the one I had painted by the coast. It showed a woman standing on the shore, her back to the viewer, the wind lifting her hair. He walked up to me and said, "That's you, isn't it?" I smiled softly. "It's who I became." He nodded. "She looks free." "She is." Later that evening, as I was leaving the gallery, the sky was streaked with soft pink and gold. I stood outside for a moment, breathing in the cool air, and I thought about all the years I had lived waiting for someone to notice me, to love me, to tell me I mattered. But the truth was, I always had. I just had forgotten. And now I remembered. When I went home that night, the house was quiet again, but it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt peaceful. I poured myself a cup of tea, sat by the window, and watched the moon rise. Daniel came in later, stood by the doorway, and said, "You're different now. Stronger." I smiled at him gently. "No, Daniel. I've always been strong. You just never looked close enough to see it." He nodded, and for once there were no words left between us, only understanding. He turned away, and I watched him go, feeling no bitterness, no pain, just peace. That night, as I got ready for bed, I looked at my reflection in the mirror. There were lines on my face, yes, but they told a story, one of love, endurance, loss, and quiet rebirth. I whispered to my reflection, "You made it through." And for the first time in years, I truly believed it. I didn't know what the future would hold, whether we would stay together or eventually drift apart completely. But I knew this much. I was no longer living in the shadow of someone else's recognition. I was living in the light of my own worth. That realization didn't come with tears or dramatic music. It came with silence. The kind of silence that feels full, not empty. The kind that means you've made peace with your story. The next morning, I stepped outside as the sun rose. The world looked softer, golden. I held my coffee cup in both hands and whispered to the quiet air, "Thank you for breaking me just enough to rebuild me stronger." And when I turned to go back inside, I smiled. Not because everything was perfect, but because I was, in my own quiet way.